These are the best rares and mythics for Aetherdrift Draft. If you see these cards, you should probably take them, and they're oftentimes even worth switching colors for late or trying to splash. First up is Perilous Snare. For 3 mana, you get a removal spell, which is already reasonable, but it also wins you the game if you get into a board stall late by letting you activate it to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures or vehicles, which is just fantastic. A lot of the time, you might end up in a board stall in this format, and this card ensures that you will have the advantage if that happens, which is just what you need from a card that's already solid as a kill spell. It's fantastic. Next is Loot the Pathfinder. It's a lot of colors, so it does require some upfront investment in your mana base, but it really pays you off. Not only does it have Double Strike, Vigilance, and Haste, but importantly, it has 3 exhaust abilities, and key among those is the ability to draw 3 cards and the ability to deal 3 damage to any target, which is just stellar. You're going to be getting tons of card advantage when you play Loot, and if your opponent doesn't kill it on sight, you're just going to run away with the game. Even if they do, you can often wait until you have 6 mana to play this card so that you can immediately activate its exhaust ability. Generally, the blue one is going to be really good for pulling you ahead on cards, though if you need to kill something really badly, the red one is a good one to start with as well. Just a stellar card and definitely worth splashing. Next is the Ether Spark. We went from a 3-color card to a colorless card. This card is fantastic partially because it is colorless, which means you can put it into any deck. If you take this card, it's going straight into your deck, and that is fantastic in draft, where sometimes you're not going to be able to play your most powerful cards if that color or colors aren't open. So the Ether Spark is really good because if you take it early, you know it's going into your deck and it's going to do a lot of work. For a +1 ability, you get to grow your creatures and start really upping the loyalty on Ether Spark by having that creature deal damage. Then the -5 of drawing 2 cards is kind of what you want to start activating as soon as possible. You put it on a creature, start hitting them, and then you start activating that -5, just getting so much card advantage. And if your hand does get insanely full and you have a bunch of loyalty on this, adding 10 mana can be helpful, but generally just drawing more and more cards, running away with card advantage is what you want to do with the Ether Spark. It is stellar. Next, Agonisaur Rex is just killer. It's a 5-mana 8/8 trample, which is already just like wow. But really importantly, it has this cycling ability, so if in the early turns of the game you really need a combat trick, then this card also gets that role done as well. 3 mana for +2/+2, that is permanent because it's counters, and trample and indestructible is really, really good. You can save your other creatures from removal spells, you can push through damage with your big attacking creatures. It really just does it all for kind of both sides of the card and is just stellar as a result. Also, don't sleep on the fact that if you do use it as a combat trick, you're often getting card advantage because it does replace itself by drawing a card thanks to cycling. Next is Howl Squad Heavy. This card comes down on turn 3 and starts generating you an army of goblins. Even though the goblins have to attack that turn if able, a lot of the times when you play this on turn 3, your opponent might not have a blocker because maybe they just attacked you, or they don't have something that has a great block. Maybe they have just vehicles or something of that nature. But basically, if you're able to start enabling attacks with these goblins, you're really just going to take over the game. And they play really well with things like combat tricks or just removal spells to kill your opponent's blockers so that you can start chipping in with those goblins, because once you get an army of goblins, your opponent is going to be in rough shape. And then eventually you can even start adding a bunch of mana if you do have max speed, which is just nice upside to have on a card that's really going to generally just be making you a little goblin army that's kind of annoying to deal with. So for 3 mana, you can't ask for a lot more than this, and it's going to be a stellar card that you should be taking early in your drafts. Next is Riptide Earhulk. This card is difficult to cast. It costs blue, and white, so that's a lot of mana investment, but it really pays you off for that. A double strike prowess creature makes the 2/5 stats way better, because as soon as you play a single non-creature spell, you're hitting your opponent for 6 damage. If you can play 2, you hit your opponent for 8 with this, and your opponent doesn't know whether you're going to be able to play instants and sorceries on your turn, or especially instant speed spells that are going to be able to buff this up out of nowhere. So this is the sort of card that just on its stats alone is pretty formidable, but it's even better than that because when it comes into play, you get to put a target non-land permanent that each opponent controls into their library third from the top. So you're going to be able to take your opponent's best card, put it into their library, and then attack your opponent on the following turn, and it's just going to be a nice removal spell attached to a creature that also just hits like a truck. So really nice card, Riptide Gearhulk. Next is Lumbering World Wagon. This is a terrifying card to see on turn 3, because even though its crew cost is 4, it also ramps you up to be able to help crew it, because on the next turn after you play it, you're going to have 5 mana if you're hitting your land drops, and a lot of the 5 mana creatures in this format are going to be able to crew a crew 4 vehicle, especially in green. So even though the crew cost is high, you play this on turn 3. On turn 4, you play a 5-drop and crew up your Lumbering World Wagon, hit them for 6 damage at that point because it gets another land from your deck. So if they can't block a 6/4 creature, then you're going to be hitting them for a huge chunk of damage, getting another land from your deck. And then the following turn, you get to play even bigger creatures if this thing survives. Even if it doesn't survive, you've gotten a bunch of lands, hit them and traded with one of their biggest creatures, and started ramping out and accelerating the early turns of the game. It's just a fantastic card advantage built into a giant creature that scales decently with the game, because the star 4 power is going to be bigger in the late game. But generally, if you just play this on turn 3, it's just going to absolutely devastate your opponents. Next is Mu Yanling Windrider. For 4 mana, you get a 2/4 that also comes with a vehicle and a ton of card advantage. A lot of the time, you're going to want to play this when you already have a vehicle or flying creature in play, so you can immediately start getting that card advantage. And generally, Mu Yanling is going to run away with the game unless they kill it on sight. And a lot of the times, you're going to end up with some cards anyway, because you'll just get to draw that card as soon as it comes into play if you already have a creature with flying or vehicle that can take to the skies anyway. So Mu Yanling is great, and even if they do kill it, you end up with that 3/2 vehicle that's easy to crew, and so that's a nice upside to have left behind. It's really a nice card on all fronts, and can just take over a game by itself, which is just what you're looking for in your high-powered rares and mythics. Next is Draconautics Engineer. For 2 mana, you get a 2/2 creature. Relatively high bar on the start, just because, 2 mana, 2/2. But it has 2 exhaust abilities that are really good, especially the 4 mana ability to make a 4/4 red dinosaur dragon creature token with flying. A lot of the times, if you have like 5 mana, you're going to want to wait until you can immediately play this and activate it to get the dragon token. And then the ability to exhaust to give your other creatures haste and just put a counter on the Draconautics Engineer means that you're going to end up with a relatively sizable creature. If you chop this in the late game, then you can play it and activate all of its abilities in 1 turn potentially, and just hit your opponent with 5 out of nowhere, because the dragon will gain haste. And just overall, the card just does a lot for 2 mana investment up front, and then the ability to activate these exhaust abilities, which is just what you're looking for in your red aggressive cards. So Draconautics Engineer, not a card you should be sleeping on. Next, we have Sabsunin Luxa Embodied, which is just a stellar card. It comes in as a 5 mana 6/6 reach trample with Indestructible that's fully operational because it has 0 counters, and that means it will be able to attack and block the turn that it comes into play. But at the beginning of your first main phase, you put a counter on Sabsunin, and then if it has an odd number of counters on it, you draw 2 cards. So it comes in immediately. It's a really big creature that's really impossible to deal with pretty much because of that Indestructible. Sure, there's some enchantment-based removal or things like that, or exile spells that can deal with it, so keep that in mind. It's not impervious to kill spells, but generally it's going to be really tricky to deal with, especially for certain color combinations. Comes in, blocks really well, and then it gets a counter on its next turn, which means it can't block anymore, but you do draw 2 cards to help find more blockers or removal spells, and then the following turn it's an 8/8 and can hit your opponent for a huge amount of damage or be a blocker again. It's just really hard to deal with this card once it's in play if you're able to have any other support in your deck to keep yourself alive. The longer you survive, the harder it is to lose, and this card really helps you survive in a lot of ways by finding new cards and also being a big creature half of the time that's really hard to deal with. So Sabsunin Luxa Embodied is absolutely stellar. It's definitely a card you should consider splashing if you are in just any green deck or even any blue deck, and overall it's a card that's going to win you a lot of games. Finally, I wanted to do an honorable mention for this special guest card. Sky Sovereign Console Flagship is just unreal. For 5 mana, it's colorless, so you can put this into any deck, and when it enters or attacks, it deals 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker. Generally, you're going to care mostly about the creature's part in limited, and just basically just take over the game on its own. It's got Crew 3, which can be a little bit tricky, but it's definitely worth just taking this card every time you see it, because it's going to be a colorless way to just take over the game for just 5 mana, which is absolutely fantastic. And it is in that special guest slot, so I just wanted to give it more of an honorable mention than an official spot on that top 10 list. But its card is unreal, one of the best cards you could possibly have in the set. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, leave #TheBest in the comment section down below. Let me know which rare or mythic is your favorite. I hope you have fun in your next Aetherdrift draft.